Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Here he is. Hi, everybody. How you doing? Good morning, everybody. It is Wednesday, October 27th, 2021. Time for another show, as evidenced by the fact that I have received the morning tweet from Bill. You can't start the show without that, even though I frequently do. I don't want to. That's not my intention. But today, the Kagro in the Morning radio show is live now. Hey, everybody. It's Jean Vest Day. That explains it. Yeah, explains yesterday anyway. And Kagro X is so excited he's wearing 6 of them just to outdo Steve Bannon, who's only wearing 3. Let's see. One of them is even covered in rhinestones, partner. Yeah. I should have gotten to a... if I'd have known this was going to happen, maybe it'll become a trend. Lots of photos of... The reference here is photos of Kyrsten Sinema presiding over the Senate yesterday, just the Senate President pro tem designee presiding over the debate. And yeah, for whatever reason, I mean, she dresses wacky and all, but yesterday she showed up in a denim vest, which, caught a lot of people by surprise, let's say. Not the usual mode of dress for the presiding officer of the Senate, to be sure. But we're all for bending the rules, and she's done that, and nothing materially changed, although it does evidence perhaps a certain lack of interest in decorum or whatever. But, okay, we were told she was a maverick, and she's an outsider, and blah, 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 and so I guess that explains the whole thing. Anyway, yeah, I saw some pretty good jokes about it yesterday. Let's see, there was... who made them? I'll have to scroll back and make sure I credit them properly. What was it, Bob Seska? Is that how he says his last name? We never say any of these things out loud, but putting them alongside a shot of Sinema, TV's Schneider from One Day at a Time, the original One Day at a Time. Schneider wants his wardrobe back. And there was another. What was the other joke that I saw? It wasn't all that... wasn't all that different, but there we are. Oh yeah, right. Let's see the tweet from LOL Ennui, Mr. Problems, as it's labeled here. It says when you have to just a shot of Kyrsten Sinema in her jean vest at the desk here. When you have to gut parental leave at 9, but the Battle of the Bands is at 10. So she shows. Yeah, I mean she had black T-shirt, short sleeve T-shirt underneath. And a big chunky looking leather strap type bracelet going on, and all ready to go to, I don't know, the biker rally or something like that, or, hey, for all I know, the Battle of the Bands. So, not a huge issue. It's just what people are talking about. It was a little weird, and okay, she wears all sorts of crazy things, and she annoys a lot of people. And, in the Senate, maybe that's not a great idea, but, what can you do? You got to court her vote nonetheless. So plenty of other things of greater substance going on. Some very interesting tidbits of news and some major issues as well. Perhaps we'll save for the second half of the show, the latest out of Loudoun County. But you'll be very interested to know if that word was interested, if you didn't hear that one come out correctly. I didn't get it all the way out of my mouth before chewing it up and swallowing it for breakfast. But you may be interested to know that the court case, or at least one of what will be 2 court cases underlying the great Loudoun County, the third great Loudoun County School Board freakout, the one about transgender students, transgender rights, and the Republican myth of the predator in the bathroom striking out against random girls who enter the bathroom, turns out not to be true, pretty much just like said. And however, for those of you waiting to hear about what was going to be done with the suspect in this case, the suspect in the case is no longer a suspect, he's a convict in this case. Of course, a juvenile convict, and so we don't know exactly how things will go for him, and they're still not naming him, and that's the usual policy and wise, but appeared before a juvenile court judge yesterday who concluded that there was sufficient evidence to find that he did in fact commit this attack and that the attack does in fact constitute a rape, and punishment will be forthcoming. So in that sense, things appear to be going right. The family of the victim apparently, the word I saw used was gratified, if not necessarily satisfied, that things went well for the case in court. So I guess that's a good thing too. Students were walking out of school in protest yesterday all over Loudoun County, although it was unclear whether the students themselves knew exactly what it was or agreed upon what it was anyway, that they were walking out on. I'm fairly certain that a substantial percentage of those who walked out had a good idea of what it was they were walking out about, whether or not that, matched with reality, or the reality in the minds of the other students that also walked out, I have my doubts about. But also, surely there were just a few people who, you know how it is with high school kids. Probably some kids were just like, let's just go outside and it'll be fun and interesting and there'll be a number of other people out there and we won't get in trouble. So we got notes from the school about it all day long, about how they were going to permit a 10-minute walkout as planned. And so long as things remained peaceful and there was no major disruption and no signage for whatever reason, could be a safety issue, could just be school decorum issue, but no signage allowed. And they were going to provide a safe space on the sidewalk in front of the school so that protests could be lodged, whatever they might be. And they did it and did it safely. And we're back in class. And our on-the-ground report from an actual Loudoun County student who gave us a first-hand account of things was, I looked out the window and I saw a bunch of people out there, and I thought, and that was probably, the reaction of the vast majority of students all over the county. But an important story, we'll dissect it later on in perhaps more granular detail, but very interesting developments from yesterday, and very interesting developments in the online discussion world when you bring up the interesting developments. And the usual suspects were out, and many of them trolls and bots, but many of them people with legitimate concerns. Difficult to separate wheat from the chaff sometimes on issues like that. When people find out that there's a really highly flammable issue like that, tends to draw the trolls and bots and people who excel, or who think they excel, at fooling others into not being able to tell which one is which. But I think people are getting smarter and smarter every day about how to deal with that and which ones are which. Anyway, much more in store for discussion that qualifies as a bona fide national issue, attracting the attention of, say, our national legislature. Hard at work at concluding, possibly, finally concluding, Infrastructure Week, for one thing. And maybe on to reconciliation. They've set some lofty goals for themselves in terms of getting their work done this week. Greg Dworkin now here, ready to roll, handing out the headlines for the rest of us. Good morning, Greg.
Hey, good morning. So let me switch topics, but give you an example of right-wing hype about something that probably isn't true.
All right.
Okay, and this is from Fox News. Fox News has this very inflammatory headline.
It's not true?
Minnesota surgeon loses his job after telling school board to let parents make decisions about masking kids.
Yeah, I bet that's exactly how it went.
Yeah, I'm sure it's exactly how it went. A surgeon in Minnesota lost his job this month, days after telling school officials at a public meeting parents should have the right to decide whether their children wear masks to school or not. Then they go on to report what he said, which is completely irrelevant. 9 days after that school board meeting, Horak said he was told his views were no longer congruent with that of Lake Region Healthcare and was asked to either resign or be terminated.
All right.
I don't believe governments or institutions should dictate that, Horak said in a public statement on October 23rd. But the Lake Region Healthcare deferred questions to the medical group, saying the medical group board made the decision about discontinuing him, not us.
All right.
And the medical group board said they made the decision to discontinue him after a thorough review process. The reasons for the separation are confidential. This is a decision that was made by his peers, who serve on the medical group board, not by Lake Region Healthcare, the community-based hospital.
Okay.
Okay. So he was saying, I don't really know why I was terminated.
It's a big mystery.
But having participated in those processes, because it's confidential, they can't really tell you why he was terminated.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
but,
that's good.
Let me just speculate, since we don't know, that it's highly unlikely that such a peer review process could be organized and finished in 9 days.
Oh, it's not like it's reconciliation bill or anything.
Well, even reconciliation has taken a little bit longer than 9 days.
I don't recall having ever worked on it before, but okay.
Right? So, I mean, these things take months.
I would think.
And so whatever came up 9 days prior to his being terminated probably had nothing whatsoever to do with what he said at the school board. But he's using it to hide behind because it's confidential, so nobody can say, well, it wasn't. It was something else.
Yeah.
And whatever it was, since termination is generally not what's happened in so many cases of peer review, you'd have to think that it was pretty significant for him to be terminated.
Yes.
And risk court cases and all this other stuff. So I'm just saying, here's a guy who, for whatever reason, his peers think should not be associated with them, gets canned, and then he says, well, 9 days ago I said something at a school board, must have been that,
right?
And Fox News runs with the headline.
Yeah, I mean,
now,
very convenient.
It's not an election issue the way it is with Virginia. Yes. But that's how these things work.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, this happens all the time. One of the most frequent, it's like a whole genre unto itself, is people saying things like, well, I was arrested just for walking down the sidewalk. Well, you were walking down the sidewalk, and I don't know, setting bear traps, but my description is I was walking down the sidewalk, and that's legal. That's totally legal. Yeah, people do this all the time. This one is a doctor. I see the picture of him in his tweet there. Showed up at the meeting in scrubs. Is he got a mask on? It looks like he's got it dangling down.
It's about no masks.
It's weird because I can't tell what's around his neck. And in scrubs, it looks like he might have taken a surgical mask down to speak, but I guess he just didn't believe in those. Maybe that's a reason to terminate him as a doctor at the hospital.
Right, he refused to wear a mask during surgery.
It's actually unsafe, and I'm surprised it took us this long to can him, but all right.
Anyway, so that just since the Virginia thing came up,
sure,
and we'll talk about Virginia election in a little bit, I just thought that was kind of relevant in terms of how these stories work, and then you actually check into them, and it turns out that what they said happened didn't actually happen. And had it not been an election year, you might not even have heard it in quite the same way.
I think that's right. Good eye.
So, just keep an eye for those things and don't believe everything you read or hear. So here's another interesting thing that happened yesterday.
Yeah.
And that is that the famous committee from the FDA, which has a whole bunch of acronyms associated. It's the VRBPAC. The Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee.
VRB.
This is the committee that advises the FDA about whether or not you should get vaccines.
You should.
Right? It showed complexity because the committee voted 17-0 with one abstention that kids 5 to 11 should get the Pfizer vaccine.
Mm-hmm. And the abstention was a kid, 5 to 11?
The abstention
probably
is actually what we're going to talk about. It's an FDA advisor by the name of Michael Kurilla, and he made some points, and I want to address some of those points because it gives you an idea of how the whole process is working. And it's not to dump on him.
Oh, all right.
Although he made enough points that some of his peers are saying, well, if you really thought that way, you should have voted no, but that's okay. You made some points, and they need to be addressed. And that's what I want to do.
Well, that's nice.
But I just think, again, people need to be reminded the advisory committee was yesterday. The FDA then votes this week as to whether to accept what the advisory committee says.
Okay.
And the FDA says whether or not you can get vaccines.
Okay.
Then it goes to the CDC. The CDC has an advisory committee.
Oh, boy.
ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And then after that decision, it goes to the full CDC with the final decision being made by Rachel Walensky, who is the director.
This is like
the CDC decides whether you should get vaccines. So whether you can is FDA, and whether you should is CDC.
Okay.
And then most people follow what CDC says, still, even after all this time.
This is an interesting process, and if you understand this one because you're a doctor, and I guess you do, this is a great parallel to one of those. FDA is the authorizing committee, and the CDC is the appropriations committee, and together they make up what we think of as the budget and money that gets spent.
Excellent.
So there you go.
There you go.
If you happen to understand that process,
studying process sometimes helps you. Studying process is sometimes done because, like, you're stuck in it and you have to.
Right. Or you have 2 hours to fill.
Or you have 2 hours to fill. Like 5 times a day, 5 times a week. But it's still interesting and affects what happens. So this fellow Michael Kurilla wasn't keen on voting yes, and he abstained. Now this is emergency use authorization.
Okay.
Emergency use authorization means that once everybody signs off on it, as we discussed, after we actually have our final budget, it's still only emergency use. It's not full authorization, which will take longer after collecting more data. Why is that important? You're not going to see mandates until that.
Okay.
So don't even worry about, but are they going to mandate it in schools? Don't worry about that until you see full use. Not a discussion for now.
Okay, but there's no reason you can't get a headline freaking out about it, if you wish.
Sure.
Go for it.
Fired for, discussing whether or not they should be mandates. Well,
pretty much.
Why? If you were fired, it probably wasn't over that. You can claim it was, but it was probably over something else.
Right.
So anyway, this fellow says, here are my objections.
Okay.
And I want to address one of them at least. The first one, he says, is the longest follow-up for a subset of the trial subject was only 3 months. 2 months past the second dose. So we only looked at it for 3 months, and then you're asking us to make a decision, and that's one of the reasons I abstained. And a pharmacist weighs in on Twitter. And the reason I want to highlight this is I think it's so key to the whole discussion we've been having for weeks and months. He says, I disagree with the implication that the panelists would jump right in with these points. Truthfully, if he felt that way, he should have voted that way. What would longer follow-up have achieved? Since the vast majority of vaccine adverse effects occur right away within the first month after vaccination, it isn't a safety issue to follow it longer. The children are still enrolled, and we'll learn more from them. And waiting 6+ months to find out the answer to what happens after 6 months, not 3 months, delays vaccination.
Yes.
Well, but that's really the whole point here. The scientists are appropriately saying we don't have enough information to really know what's going to happen 6 months and a year from now.
With kids.
Okay. Well, with anybody.
Oh, we don't have
because
that?
This is how the whole process worked for vaccines in general.
Yeah.
When they went for emergency use authorization, let me emphasize, emergency use. Why? There's a pandemic going on.
That's an
emergency.
So
the scientists who are saying, but we don't have enough information to know what's going to happen 6 months and a year from now, the non-scientists who finally had to make the decision said, and even some of the scientists, with some political sense in their body, said, we don't have 6 months or a year to make this decision. Well, it's a pandemic. This is emergency use. Based on what we know now, we have to make the best decision we can, and we will. And if you can't make the decision, the politicians will make the decision.
Yeah, well, okay.
And again, that's how the process works. And I've said this before, and I liken it to the commander-in-chief of the armed forces as a civilian. And the armed forces experts will make the recommendations, and the civilian, in the end, will decide. Buck stops at the president's desk. So the idea that I'm miffed because they're not waiting as long as I told them to is weird.
You have doubts. That's
I get that, it's a valid point. It's not wrong.
Right.
But it's weird because we're in the middle of a pandemic and there's a lot of parents that want their kids vaccinated. And what are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, if you waited and then the answer is what happens after 6 months? Nothing. What's the answer to the people whose kids got seriously ill in the time that they were waiting? We were waiting to see nothing.
Right. And then he goes on to make some, again, very valid points. I'm not dumping on him for having these doubts. These are appropriate doubts that ought to be looked at, but not necessarily the things that make the decision. There's other things making the decision. This isn't It's following the science, but it's not just the science.
Mm-hmm.
Because people are involved.
Yeah, I get you. I mean,
right, and people are in statistics. So he points out children already demonstrate asymptomatic COVID infections about 50% of the time. And since the trial endpoint only evaluated symptomatic disease, it probably overestimated infection prevention. In other words, if you got a vaccine and then checked to see whether the kids were symptomatic, you might have missed asymptomatic infections. So maybe it didn't work quite the way you thought. Of course, if they're asymptomatic, do you care? Well, you do if they're going to spread. So, again, it is nuanced. But from a parental point of view, they are not here looking at hospitalizations and deaths. It's not adults. Kids don't generally, although they do wind up, they don't generally wind up nearly as much as adults do. But the parental interest here is in making sure the kids don't get sick at all.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So that's why it's much more of a relevant discussion. I think it was relevant for the adults because that's what younger adults think too. No adult thinks they're going to wind up in the hospital, especially the ones who aren't vaccinated. They think that happens to other people. If you are vaccinated, you definitely think that happens to other people.
Yes. True.
And generally it does happen to other people. But the point is, in this particular trial, the data submitted by the company, and company data is always suspect and ought to be questioned rigorously, and that's why these committees exist.
Okay.
The company was talking about symptomatic infection, but didn't give them enough data about asymptomatic infection, so he had a concern.
Okay, it's a concern. I am a little, why didn't they just test people and find out whether they had asymptomatic infections? I would like to know.
Too expensive, but they didn't do it. Yeah. About 20% of subjects in the trial had evidence of past infection, and none of these experienced reinfection. But again, it was a very short period of time.
Yes.
But if they didn't show reinfection, then why are we vaccinating them? And if half the kids are infected, then why do we need to do this? That's his point.
Okay.
And because the Pfizer vaccine offers protection against serious disease, even after antibody titers have waned, there's some basis for immunity. But at the lower dose in children, it's not clear that we have the same way of looking at it as with adults.
Okay. That sounds a little complicated, but lower dose.
You can't just assume. You can't just assume kids are little adults.
Right.
So in other words, what do we know about the long-term implications of being vaccinated? We don't. So you can't claim that it's long-term if you don't know. And so there's a lot we don't know, and so we shouldn't go ahead and recommend it.
All right.
Again, that gets back to the original point. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Parents are worried about the kids. It's not a safety issue. And so you don't want to do anything until you collect more information. And the non-scientist parents want to do something if it's safe.
Yeah, 17 of them wanted to do something.
Right. So, again, this pharmacist, Jason Gallagher, points out children, yes, have less severe infection than adults. They also die. 30% of the kids who have died from COVID had no medical issues. And if you think this should be restricted to high-risk kids, then the CDC, whether you should committee, will consider that.
Okay, but you'll miss 30% of the...
Yeah, I mean, so, again, remember, we recall cribs if 3 kids have problems with it.
Right. So,
and if you think that's an over-exaggeration, I don't think so.
No,
it's really not an exact number. It must be 3, can't be 2, can't be 5. But, you just need a small number of children to have issues before something's going to be recalled.
Yeah. I've experienced that.
Right. One of the other complaints that the guy had, which is valid, is that Pfizer had a 3-week dosing interval. Moderna had 4. 4 is probably better. This data was submitted with 3-week dosing intervals. That's suboptimal. Why didn't they do 4? I'm not sure I can say yes.
Okay.
Again, these are all valid concerns. But the question on the table is, are they valid enough to stop the under emergency use?
Yeah, well, not
so.
So
the pharmacist says, it's 3-week dosing intervals are probably suboptimal, but they work.
Okay.
And if waning became an issue, that can be addressed later. What are you trying to say? They don't vaccinate because you may have to do so again?
Yeah, so far that has not.
We do a flu shot every year.
Right, okay. I mean, okay, so, it's a good idea to have had that one vote, especially if you want people to examine your concerns, maybe the abstention makes sense he's very sophisticated and he knows that people will read the news and say 17-0 to 1. What does that even mean? And they'll look to see, why is that 1 there?
Well, one's a tie. You get 1 point instead of 2. Everybody knows that. Don't you follow hockey?
Yeah, right. Those people can understand that. But yeah, they'll go and they'll check to see what accounts for that thing, and then they'll read this guy's objections. And hopefully they won't then go protest at a hospital.
But my point is that they are reasonable injections. Reasonable injections, also. And therefore they should be approved. The reasonable objections from scientists.
One of them, anyway.
But ultimately, this is why scientists make the recommendation and non-scientists make the decision. It's true that we'd have more information a year from now than we do now. But we can't wait a year. That's our decision, not yours.
Yes. All right.
That's the point I'm trying to make here.
Sense. And all right. So the guy's objections are on the record. There's nothing wrong with them.
They're reasonable. They'll be taken up by the full FDA. The FDA will decide. Chances are they'll decide, yes, go ahead with this. And his objections will then be forwarded to the CDC committee.
Okay.
Who will say, okay, given that we can, should we? And let's look at it. And then we'll refer that to the actual big CDC. And the director will make the final decision. And then all of this will be fixed in terms of making a final decision that CDC endorses well before Thanksgiving. Okay. And pediatric offices are ready to go because one of the things that came out of this is that the pediatric doses can go in regular refrigerators, so regular offices can go ahead and store them.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's good news. I don't know that it makes sense. I don't understand why, but apparently it doesn't have to be as cold. So the children are not little adults, but we can store their stuff in little freezers.
Right, so Space Force doesn't have to fetch them from the moon.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We continue with Greg Dworkin. A very interesting explanation of the process by which these vaccines get approved. And I like the bifurcating this into, can you get it? Is it scientifically sound for us to inject this into your body? And should you get it? Like, I don't know what that question translates into, but are we going to say everybody should go get this thing? Just because it's available and safe doesn't mean that everybody should run to the store and get one. But now, after that decision is made, we'll find out more about it. But also helps explain, a lot of things. And it even explains the committee system, too, right? Like, this advisory committee says, we think that you should go ahead with it here at the FDA. And then the FDA makes a decision, a little bit like subcommittee, full committee, or full committee, full house kind of bifurcation of the process. Lots of parallels to be drawn. The committee system makes a great deal of sense.
Yeah, well, that judge, passed the judiciary, but that doesn't mean he's a judge yet.
Yeah, right. This is our recommendation.
It's got to go to the full house. And just because the committee recommended that he be approved doesn't mean that the full Senate will do it.
Right. That's true, too. In fact, it doesn't even mean it'll get a vote because there needs to be
Because Mitch McConnell, that's what he does,
Yeah.
So, yes. So, it's a committee process is committee process, and it's a part of the whole. And unless the committee is a committee of the whole, this is the way it works.
Right. Only a committee of the whole in the House, everybody. Remember that. For no reason. That'll never come up. Not even in a trivia question.
Also on the quiz, and I'm not telling you what's on the test. I'm not teaching to the test, but just remember, only one of the chambers has a scepter on the wall.
Oh. Yeah, I don't know. I'm thinking about that. The Senate might have one. They just don't take the mace. You mean? Yeah.
The mace. Yeah.
I think the Senate may have one. I'll have to check.
What happens to ivermectin story?
I mean, to step on
take out fraud and high risk of bias studies.
Okay.
Eric Topol looked at this. Ivermectin for COVID-19 addressing potential bias in medical fraud. If you leave in the fraud stories and the high risk of bias stories, looks like ivermectin has a significant response. But if you take them out, it becomes non-significant. So he did a nice analysis of that. There was one major fraud story that had to be retracted, 3 high risk of bias stories that ought to have been retracted. But even if you include them, and the low risk stories that had low risk studies that have no concerns, there's 4 of them, excellent studies, and the 4 studies, so that's a total of 8 with some concerns or no concerns, show no significant response. So ivermectin doesn't work. It's pretty clear. And, just like the story of the Wisconsin surgeon or the Virginia school violence rape issue, the initial telling of it doesn't necessarily tell you what exactly happened. And as you get more information, you find that what you thought you knew or what you thought you heard even in the beginning turns out not really to be what happened.
Okay.
So that's what happened with ivermectin too. So add that to the pile.
All right. Well, the horses are pleased to have it back. They've been waiting. They have a supply chain problem for the horse medicine, and the horses are glad to have it back from the humans.
So in the final week of the Virginia governor's race,
yes,
we have some interesting issues. Terry McAuliffe, having Biden in for a rally, reminded Virginia of a couple of things. That Glenn Youngkin started this race claiming that there were concerns about the 2020 election and that, of course, Trump is backing him. But what's finishing the race is what often finishes the race in Virginia, and that's issues about education, various and sundry. You mentioned one of them. Often it's traffic and transportation, too, but that doesn't seem to be a major issue this time around. So Glenn Youngkin in the last week decided that it would be smart for reasons that people will judge on Tuesday.
Yes.
That it was a good idea to attack Toni Morrison's Beloved as a book that schools offer. Many advanced placement tests actually ask about the book.
Oh.
And so, if you're in advanced placement English and you take an AP English test, you might be expected to know something about it, but you can't, of course, if the book is banned by your school.
Right.
Is that an issue for suburban upscale voters? Well, you tell me. We'll talk about it in a week. But Youngkin made an issue of it and is permeating the airwaves, I'm told. You can tell me. You live there. With ads about, a mom whose high school kid had bad dreams because this book was somehow included in the curriculum. Yes,
he really did not like the book, and there's some disturbing passages. I'm aware of that. There's a reason for having them,
right? But Catcher in the Rye was written by a white guy, so they didn't pick on that.
I guess not. By the way, the kid who had nightmares about it is now like an adult and in the working world. This was some time ago that this happened.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of the, parents against cathode ray tubes that come to these meetings are like in their 70s.
Yeah, and they're dining out on the same.
My kid was really upset about this. Yeah, well, he's 55 now. So a couple of things to say about that. Terry McAuliffe's statement on Glenn Youngkin's latest racist dog whistle. In final week, Glenn Youngkin closes out campaign with culture war messaging, threatens to ban American classic and silence Black Nobel Prize winning author.
Okay, yes.
The final week of this race,
Yeah.
Glenn Youngkin has doubled down on the same divisive culture wars that have fueled his campaign from the very beginning. I'm sorry I don't say it divisive, but I'm from New York. Youngkin's closing message of book banning and silencing esteemed black authors is a racist dog whistle designed to gin up support from the most extreme elements of his party, mainly his top endorser and surrogate, Donald Trump. So with that statement, McAuliffe brings up the fact that this is crazy, and by the way, Donald Trump. So
Right.
Well done, Terry McAuliffe, because
Good plan.
that's certainly part and parcel of what he's trying to do as he runs.
Yes.
All right. And one of the things that I found so interesting about that is this remarkable story that Garrett Epps wrote for Washington Monthly, which I didn't include on the list I gave you, so I'll give it to you right now, and you can pretend I sent it this morning.
All right.
Want to know more about critical race theory? Look at Virginia schools for more than 75 years.
Okay.
And Garrett Epps says, Republican candidate Glenn Youngkin was raised on official state-taught racism. I should know, so was I. And points out they went to the same schools.
Oh.
And when Youngkin says, we got to get critical race theory out of the schools, one Youngkin supporter told Washington Post that CRT is just a focus on race. My children weren't raised that way, which brings up 2 points. First, politicians and even some news people are using the term critical race theory the way Vizzini in The Princess Bride used the word inconceivable. They seem to think it means something like Trotskyite.
Right.
Right? And for people who want to know what it actually means, he gives references, but that's not the point. He says, in 30 years as a legal academic, I got to know CRT and its proponents well. I've read many papers, attended many academic panels. I found some electrifying and others to be over-the-counter sleep aids. It's an academic movement. But the second point is that even if critical race theory were exerting some massive influence, none of its efforts would compare in scope and determination with the systematic and successful 75-year campaign by Virginia and other southern states to control what was taught to students. When we consider Virginia parents' complaint they weren't raised that way, this history needs to be considered, and gives examples and history of how it all got in there. And he gives a good example. One of the 3 textbooks, only slightly revised in 1964, were only withdrawn by the State Board of Education in 1972. And even after that, some school systems defiantly continue their use. One of the 3, Virginia's History and Geography, explained that the lost cause was inspired by states' rights and altruism. Quote, Virginians love the U.S. and did not want to leave it, but Virginians wanted people in every state to have their rights, end quote. After the war, it said Robert E. Lee, because of his greatness, bravery, and his love for Virginia, would always be a hero, end quote. And another one, Virginia History, Government, Geography, explained that slavery, quote, made it possible for the Negroes to come to America and make contact with civilized life, end quote.
Right, free tickets.
They were lucky to live far away from the spears and war clubs of enemy tribes in Africa. Plantation life was happy and prosperous.
Oh, my stomach hurts.
Yeah, true. There's a teeny bit of whipping. But whipping was also the usual method of correcting children. And anyway, all slaves were given medical care.
Oh, my God.
He's quoting these books and saying this is what was taught in Virginia. And to say, I don't like what's going on in the schools because they're not teaching them the way I was raised. He's making the point that Glenn Youngkin and he are similar age, and they would have been exposed to the similar books. And these are the books he's talking about.
Yeah, well, that's a great service that he's doing us by. I mean, it's stomach churning, but I mean, you know.
I mean, you're in Virginia. Did you know this? You weren't born and raised there. You didn't go to school there.
No, I didn't. My kids do, and I can tell you it's quite different. He's not claiming that it's still taught by any stretch of the imagination, and I've seen the materials. It's not the case. But it is, I guess, if you were taught this and either believed it or took it with a grain of salt even, but then compare what your kids in school are learning now, you'll say, change. You know, if you're that kind of person, it's very different. Obviously, like it's real, and they tell you what really happened and what the real story was, and that'll be upsetting to people who are, you know, racist.
Well, again, you know, going along with the theme of today's show,
yes,
what you originally hear about this when you actually delve into it and see what's going on isn't exactly the same impression that you got when you first heard the story here.
Yes, right. That's the theme. True. And yeah, I mean, that's exactly what they're what they're saying. The big complaint, what you get in the 30-second commercial or on the bumper sticker is they're all wrapped up in race. Why can't we all just get along, kind of thing? And they're the real racists, people who are teaching about racism. And if you take even a moment to figure out what's going on, yeah, I mean,
Epps finishes this with a good thing to say. Ahead. The issue is not whether Youngkin read these books as a student. It's that he and I both grew up white and privileged in a society profoundly shaped by the shameful state-imposed racial ideology. Mm-hmm. Many of my teachers, and undoubtedly many who taught Youngkin at his Tony Prep School, Norfolk Academy, believed implicitly in these myths, spoke of them often, wouldn't tolerate dissent from them. In other words, we were raised that way. I wasn't raised in Virginia. I went to school in Yonkers, but my AP history teacher in Yonkers was a Southern guy who taught us that, slaves were pampered, that they were just worth too much to anybody actually maltreat them.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well.
And he believed it. He believed it in his heart. And believe me, he did not tolerate dissent about different points of view. So I get that part. So Epps says, in other words, we were raised that way, and the moral stature of the Youngkins of the world to invoke Martin Luther King as a way to shut down racial dialogue is, shall we say, slight. In fact, the entire hue and cry against CRT isn't about ending division. It's about preserving it. It's not about racial reconciliation. It's about inspiring racial panic.
Yeah.
Glenn Youngkin is simply the latest in a line of mountebanks willing to stir race hatred and fear to gain power. He knows how it's done. Like me, he learned it in school. That's, again, if Terry McAuliffe wants to make school and beloved and book banning the issue in the campaign in the closing days, and then tie that to Trump, that's not a bad strategy at all.
Yeah.
And, one of the ways I know it's not a bad strategy is I see Republican operatives being really upset that McAuliffe is doing this.
Yes.
That means it's working.
I guess that's probably it. Well,
How dare you take somebody as calm and moderate and wearing vests like Glenn Youngkin and tie him to Donald Trump. You must have a bankrupt campaign if that's what you. Well, actually, what Biden said, and one of the people I saw really upset with this, I think it was Guy Benson, and he was upset with what Biden said.
Oh.
Biden said something along the lines of, not every radical, is dressed in radical clothes.
Okay.
Sometimes they wear vests and speak
like
nice.
Kirsten Sinema.
I don't know his exact quote. I can't remember, but it was something along those lines. And how dare Biden try to tie Youngkin to Trump? Whoa, Republicans are upset about that. I guess it's working.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know why they tipped their hand that way, but I guess fine, terrific. I'm glad that they do. I did learn
it wasn't just that. People were being interviewed about early voting.
Oh.
Right, and Republicans are really upset that the reason that Democrats were showing up in early voting is an anti-Trump vote.
Yeah.
And they wanted to make a point of saying this for reasons which are completely unclear to me.
Or completely stupid, anyway, because, I read that too, and I said, oh, that's right, anti-Trump. I'm going to go vote early. I'm one of those people. Let me at it. So, I mean, it motivated me to go vote. Oh, yeah, that's right. I remember why I'm voting again. I mean, I wasn't going to vote for Youngkin anyway, but, right. Can't, right, he's a Trump bootlicker. Oh, well, I could wait for Tuesday. There's usually not long lines where I vote. I'm privileged that way, but what the hell? Let's get that ballot in there now.
Right. So Larry Sabato tweeted yesterday, I think, hooray for Glenn Youngkin in his courageous battle against Toni Morrison's beloved Next Up Catcher in the Rye by dirty-minded J.D. Salinger, then ban a book overflowing with sex and violence, the Bible.
Yeah. Time for it to go. Well, it's
right.
been
and so I'm looking at Guy Benson's account, and he's retweeting people who are saying, oh, McAuliffe is lying about the fact that they want to ban these books.
What? No. The whole TV ad that Youngkin put together was about
that's the thing. I mean, the whole TV ad, the whole, couple of last weeks of the campaign is about this.
Yeah. But now it's all. Oh, no, that's all not true. Oh,
but now they're not happy because they're getting called out on it. Is the point I'm trying to make?
Okay. Well, fair enough. Keep calling them out on it, I guess.
So Ed O'Keefe has just in Democrats banking early vote lead in governor's race. Mm-hmm. Okay, and is comparing 2020 with 2021.
All right.
And, of course, you can't keep up with a presidential year. More than 700,000 voters have already cast ballots in Virginia's general election. That number's about a third of where it was a week before the presidential election last year. Mm-hmm. The total number of early votes is on track to end up near 1 million. Most early ballots are being cast in person at Virginia's early vote centers, which are scheduled to close this Saturday. While 6 in 10 Virginians voted in advance of Election Day last year, that number was far lower before the coronavirus pandemic, so it's hard to compare an off year. Mm-hmm. Many vote, and also the laws have changed. Many voters now appear to be switching back to Election Day, which is when we expect the most votes to be cast.
Okay.
There's noticeable uptick over the past few days in Democratic counties. Fairfax and Loudoun added about 40,000 and 10,000 votes respectively since last week. And overall, we estimate that the early ballots received so far make up about a quarter of the total votes expected in the election. The proportion is bigger in more Democratic areas, meaning they're likely to have a smaller share of ballots to process on Tuesday. Very Republican counties, and I think this year the early vote is going to be done first, so that may be of interest. I read that somewhere.
Smart.
I can't vouch for it as a fact because I'm not a Virginia election expert. Very Republican counties are likely to see the lion's share of the ballots cast on Election Day, and we don't know with certainty which party people are voting for, but we estimate Democrats have banked a lead of about 200,000 votes. The estimate comes from a model. For reference, Biden won early voters by over 800,000 last year. With the drop-off, Democrats can't match that, but they hope to pad their lead with as much as possible over the next few days so it becomes insurmountable by the time most Republicans make it to the polls. That said, Republican turnout and a surge of Republican voters on Election Day is possible and could tighten the race considerably. So that's where it stands. So it's not like McAuliffe is losing. It's that he's not winning by enough to say, okay, well, this is California. It's not going to be California. But, all of the analysis about the wisdom of Youngkin going all in on Toni Morrison's beloved, is a Wednesday discussion.
Okay.
A week from today, we can talk about how wise it was.
Yeah, right. We'll have the results then. Doesn't look good.
We don't have to wait 6 months or a year like that guy at the FDA.
Right. Okay.
We can wait a day. That's okay.
Yeah, and if you don't, but remember, we were all taught by the former guy that if you don't have the results in a day, it's total fraud. And even if you do, and I lose, then it's total fraud anyhow.
Right.
So, all right, great.
So there's that.
Yes.
Yeah, we're working on the consensus social spending bill. It's taking longer than everybody wants. Not much to say about that. The trade publications that follow this are, try to give you up to the minute. They're happy, they're not happy, they're happy, they're not happy. I don't find it particularly enlightening, so I tend to discount it. I look at them, but I tend to discount what they're saying. But Dave Rothkopf has an interesting piece in the Daily Beast. Biden's White House worries, will Democrats take yes for an answer? It's been a year of historic accomplishments with more coming into sight, but will the party claim credit or play into the Dems in disarray narrative instead? That's what happened with the Affordable Care Act. By the time they finished passing it, they didn't have any juice left to say, okay, this is good, we're going to sell it. Instead, they tried to run away from it and their president, which was stupid. And everybody always tells them it's stupid, and they do it anyway, and I don't know why. I assume it's because they're stupid. But, that's only an assumption on my part. I don't know that for a fact, but, it would be irresponsible not to speculate.
Right.
What you should do is pass something and then run on it and say, this is great.
Yeah, that's the usual thing, I think, the ordinary plan. But, us, we're not just going to take a plan off the shelf.
Right. Meanwhile, new cases of coronavirus are down nearly 60% since Delta variant surge. That with boosters plus vaccine for kids on the menu ought to be, touted as well. Mm-hmm. The impact of vaccination, according to the Washington Post, is clear in regions with the highest uptake. Puerto Rico recorded a 7-day average of 1,100 new cases on August 23rd, 11/21. The figure declined to 105 as of Tuesday. About 73% of Puerto Ricans are immunized, but a handful of states are still struggling. In Montana, 45 out of every 100,000 people are hospitalized. Half the state's population is fully vaccinated, below the national rate. And Colorado, Michigan, New Mexico, Utah, and Vermont have not yet stemmed the initial increase in cases and deaths triggered by the Delta variant. The U.S. has recorded more than 45 million infections during the pandemic, the most in the world, and more than 737,000 people have died. So still reason to get vaccinated, and previous infection doesn't protect you as much as a vaccination does. So you should go ahead and do that.
Okay.
And then a final point Richard Skinner makes on Twitter, just to get us back to Virginia, because I think it's a good place to end on. Mm-hmm. The phony election integrity issue was long the only issue on Youngkin's website. Oh. He then went ahead and seized on this education stuff when Terry McAuliffe said something stupid, which was, parents really shouldn't have input into, have as much input as school boards into what's taught in schools.
Yes.
That's one of those Kinsley gaffes.
I guess. Yeah, I mean,
he's probably right, but that's not something you tell voters.
Right. We love parents.
We love parents. Parents should always have input. Of course, yes. We need the professionals to weigh on this as well, and we want to keep our kids competitive compared to the rest of the country.
Yeah, and you don't want kook parents doing it. And some of you are kooks.
That's the kind of thing you don't have to say if you're running.
Right, but I'm not a surrogate, so I get to say it.
Yeah, you get to say it. But, the actual candidate shouldn't say, it's really much better for school boards to make these decisions than deplorables.
Yeah, but it is.
You can't say that.
Right. You got to blink it in Morse code.
Well, you have to make the point that you really shouldn't be banning books. Not a good idea.
Right. Focus
Where does it end?
That.
What about the Bible? It's very violent.
Yes. Right. We haven't done that one yet. Okay. Well, all these things are true. We have a week until we get our results start coming in. That's good news. On the vaccine front, I know, you mentioned that Puerto Rico has some of the best vaccine uptake. I did see that was it Charles Gaba, Brain Wrap, putting out, I think that like Puerto Rico and Guam had this fantastic surge of vaccine uptake, and we're leading the U.S. states and territories with that. And also that West Virginia, which jumped out to an early lead with their aggressive vaccination of the residents of nursing homes and assisted living facilities, has somehow fallen back to the bottom again, where they always end up, and has now one of the lower, if not the lowest, vaccine uptake rate after doing so well initially and surprising everybody. So, sad news there for West Virginia, which is suffering of late. And one other thing that I learned along the way, one follow-up. One, you're right, there's no Senate mace. How about that? I looked around for that. It seems like they would, a legislative body ought to have one in Western democracy, and it's generally
you'd think so, but the House has one, right? And the Senate doesn't?
House has one. The Senate one, when you ask about that, like, do they have one, and they just don't make a big deal out of it? No, they don't have one, and they imbue the president's gavel with that power. I don't think they ever present the gavel or hit anybody with the gavel. But
we had a discussion about this a couple of years ago, and I don't remember anything about the discussion other than that the House has one and the Senate doesn't. That's the only thing I remember.
Okay. Well,
and whether or not it's on the wall in the House was like a big deal.
Yeah, it's on.
It told you something. I don't remember what it was, but it was actually significant of whether it was like the committee as a whole or not.
Right. Yeah. When the House is meeting as the full House, the mace is up on the pedestal. And when they're meeting as the committee of the whole, they lower it down because it's.
You see, I learned something.
And you remembered it correctly, and I forgot what our lesson was. So I wanted to correct that. And one other thing, that I learned along the way, since we'll be pivoting back to Loudoun County and education issues shortly. And your mention of the story of how long Virginia education was terrible on issues of race, the Civil War, etc. I learned that Loudoun County was one of the last in the country to actually desegregate its public schools, holding out till 1967 before they finally gave in and made an actual effort to integrate the schools, which is pretty amazing, especially considering the transformation it's undergone in the last couple decades, moving from
only you outpost. Kids think of Virginia as a blue state.
Yeah, right. And it wasn't the case when I got here, and it's still a little shaky, but Loudoun County was a very red, ex-urban outpost, really rural to ex-urban outpost, and it's really suburbanized and blued up and changed in its demographic makeup, and that that scares racists. So, like I said, the same article that pointed out that they were one of the last to desegregate now points out that it's no longer the case that the majority of public secondary school students are white, ethnically white. So now a very diverse region, and that's good news, and it's protecting us from a lot of bad things, thank God. So we still have our share of controversy, but I have a lot of faith in our ability to shout down the racists and overwhelm them in numbers because of what I see when I look around me. This was of great comfort to me in the initial days of the Trump administration, and noticing how, being out at the mall doing holiday shopping and saying, it's going to be awfully difficult to sell white supremacy around here. It's just going to be a tough sell, and thank God for it.
Anyway, that's it for me.
Okay.
I'll leave you with a reminder that the jury selection's going on in the Unite the Right white supremacist trial involving arguing over Antifa and Daily Kos, as it turns out.
Oh.
And that's from Charlottesville, Virginia.
Yeah, Virginia.
So that's in the news as well, reminding people that, this stuff is like weird.
Yeah. I guess
so apparently they're questioning the jury as to whether you believe in Antifa or whether you read Daily Kos.
Oh. Well, I mean, it's a good way to get out jury duty.
Yeah,
I don't mind telling you. Okay, I never really thought of it that way, but I'll try using it next time. Usually I just say, I'm very busy and I can't go.
Right.
Sometimes I believe it, sometimes I don't.
I read Daily Kos. I can't go.
Right. So, all right. Who knew? All right.
Who knew? Okay. Take care, and I'll talk to you as soon as tomorrow.
Yes, right. Okay, excellent. We'll be looking forward to it. The election won't be over, but I'm sure there'll be
If appliances allow it, I'll be there.
Okay. Very good. Thanks. I'll get a mace in between now and then. And I guess a nice stand for it. Maybe something carved wood on Etsy. Something cute like that. Okay. Thanks, Greg. And we'll check in with you tomorrow. Oh, look, I'm already losing your signal, but that's okay because the segment's over. All right. When we come back, more about Virginia. It's just all about Virginia, apparently, today. Some details about the case of the moral panic over transgender students being used to conflate with the other issues. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I am intrigued by the news that reading Daily Kos can get you out of jury duty. Not that, I don't know how anxious Daily Kos readers are generally to get out of jury duty. A lot of them probably think, this is my civic duty, and I would like to make sure that I, a relatively fair and open-minded person, sit on this jury as opposed to, say, someone who reads the Daily Stormer. That would be bad. Now I'm going to look at that because that's kind of interesting, probably, to many of you. Dave Newart has the story over at the Daily Kos front page. Charlottesville jury selection shows how deeply the right-wing smear of Antifa has penetrated. He doesn't even, claim the credit for Daily Kos right up there in the headline. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Maybe it's not in his article, but it might be in the what's the other one that Greg sent to me? BuzzFeed. But how ironic would it be if I had to go to BuzzFeed? Well, maybe they're just being modest over there. Let me see what Dave has to say. It's becoming clearer over time that the right's eliminationist smear campaign against anti-fascists, which originated as an extremist conspiracy theory and then blossomed into right-wing conventional wisdom thanks to media outlets like Fox News, was a phenomenal success. One need look no farther than the jury selection process in the Charlottesville civil lawsuit trial against the neo-fascist planners of the deadly 2017 Unite the Right rally, which started on Monday. Queried on the stand about their views on Antifa. Do you have to get on the stand for that? I think they usually just question you in the jury box, but who knows? I don't think I've ever made it to that stage in jury selection in Virginia. But queried on the stand about their views on Antifa, quote-unquote Antifa, many of the prospective jurors made clear that they had absorbed the smear into their worldviews. One described Antifa as a, quote, terrorist organization. Another called them troublemakers. Asked on a questionnaire if he thought Antifa was responsible for the Unite the Right violence, one potential juror answered, most likely. That is bad news. Of course, they'll end up finding themselves not on the jury, but whatever. I mean, you're worried about the number of people who believe it because eventually someone will make it through, if too many believe it, and it's just bad news in general. Indeed, the view of the pool of jurors about Antifa seemed to be a critical factor in their selection. The defendants and their attorneys argued strenuously against anyone who might have a favorable view of the movement, including whether or not they read Daily Kos. So how do you like that? That's, well, at least the mention is made there. The plaintiff's attorneys, meanwhile, were concerned about people who indicated they believed the smear. An attorney for the plaintiffs, arguing for one potential juror to be dismissed, told Judge Norman Moon, people with extreme views of Antifa may be less inclined to believe the defendants were responsible for the violence at the Unite the Right rally, and inclined to believe that the defendants' claims of violence used in self-defense, and might believe that instead. When asked why he had described Antifa as troublemakers, one potential juror said, all I hear about Antifa is what I hear on TV. It seems like they're always involving themselves in racial riots and causing a lot of problems with their political beliefs, he said. Which, I mean, I guess if you had time to drill down with the guy and just had a normal discussion, you might point out, well, why is it that you think you only hear about Antifa involving themselves in racial riots? Because who's on the other side of these riots? Usually, these aren't just people running around, beating themselves up, right? But I guess they might think, well, they just show up and break windows for no particular reason, which, hey, that's not true. What I was getting at here, obviously, is, well, Antifa, of course, you might realize is short for anti-fascist, and they involve themselves in racial riots because there are fascists on the other side of it who have, created a race riot for themselves because that's what they want out of life. And the Antifa folks show up to say, that's a bad goal. We don't think you should want that. And since we know that you people are crazy and violent and come wearing body armor and helmets and bearing shields, we know how to prepare adequately for that eventuality. Anyway, another prospective juror, as Vice's Tess Owens reported on Twitter, described Antifa as domestic terrorists on his questionnaire. Quote, I just seen what I know on television, that seems to be a theme, and the internet, he wrote. He added that he doesn't consider anti-Semitism to be a serious issue. Just thought I'd throw that one in there. I just don't believe that today we have this problem. Where I live, it doesn't seem to be a problem, he says. Okay. While several of these jurors were removed, Judge Moon denied the plaintiff's request to strike the juror who described Antifa as a terrorist organization. He was similarly reluctant to strike jurors who had more neutral views. The one juror who wrote that Antifa, quote, fights the far-right movement, was attacked by defendants Richard Spencer and Chris Cantwell, who claimed that was, quote, not a balanced perception of Antifa, and was, quote, leaning toward their side. I mean, isn't it sort of a definitional issue? What is Antifa? Well, they are anti-fascist. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means they fight the far-right movement. Wait a minute. No. That means you're leaning toward their side. Well, I'm just reading you their name. Anti-fascist. Moon, however, said he felt that the juror was qualified. So, good. Not bad decision there. Another prospective juror, numbered 220, was questioned about his politics because he reads Daily Kos. Well, all right. Good for you. Unicorn Riot reported on Twitter that Cantwell and Spencer heavily cross-examined this juror. Cantwell asked the juror where he placed Daily Kos on the political spectrum, and he answered, I don't think it's as far left as Antifa. He was also queried about listening to Tom Hartman's radio program. Oh, I didn't even make it. What? You should be listening to my radio program. You definitely get out of jury duty. You can say, I can't come to jury duty because this show is on from 9 to 11 and you start trials about that time and I just can't miss the show. Don't tell him it's a podcast. Cantwell then asked Moon to strike the juror, not like an airplane, right? But, metaphorically speaking, strike the juror, saying he had extreme views about Antifa, which he doesn't. He cited the smear campaign's oft-repeated myth blaming Antifa for, quote, burning and looting in the second half of 2020. That's a quote. Do people say that a lot, that whole quote? I don't think so. But which both statistics and studies of law enforcement reports definitively demonstrate was not the case. And by the way, in most of the most celebrated cases in which Antifa was initially blamed for particular violent acts, they often turned out to, in fact, be right-wing provocateurs instead. We know that, but I don't know whether it came up in the proceedings the other day. What else have we got here? Right, quote, he has an extremely favorable view of a group that hunts the defendants like dogs in the streets, Cantwell complained. And again with the dogs. Another defense attorney told Moon that the juror, quote, went right up to the line of identifying himself as an Antifa. How so? I don't know. Spencer chimed in, saying that the idea that he's a Daily Kos reader and watches the Tom Hartman program, I guess there's a TV program too, and hasn't heard of Richard Spencer is incredible. Spencer himself. It's incredible that you haven't heard of me. He added, I think he's lying to get on the jury. Moon was not persuaded, and he told the defendants that he thought the juror could set aside preconceived notions, because he reads Daily Kos, I would say, and try the case based on the law and the evidence. I do not think he is disqualified. So that's good. This will not be the first trial in which jurors' preconceived notions about Antifa appear to be playing a role. In the 2019 trial of an alt-right couple who shot an anti-fascist at a January 2017 protest in Seattle, the jury ended up deadlocked because of 3 members who believed the victim had it coming. There's a quote here from from the Daily Kos reporting on that trial that illustrates the point. I think the point is made even without reading the excerpts. There's an irony in the spread of these attitudes among would-be jurors in Charlottesville. Most people, after all, had not even heard of Antifa prior to the violence at the Unite the Right riots. It was in the wake of those events that what had been primarily a fringe conspiracy theory about a communist plot to depose Donald Trump became a mainstream right-wing media standard. Multiple stories on Fox and in right-wing outlets began demonizing the anti-fascist movement, apparently with the intent of blunting the growing chorus of concern over the rise of white nationalist violence that Charlottesville represented. This essentially created not just a both-siderist narrative readily adopted by other mainstream outlets, but an eliminationist one in which Antifa were depicted as so demonic in nature that they deserved no free speech or protest rights, and ultimately deserved only to be thrown out of helicopters, as the Proud Boys and other far-right thugs would have it. The narrative was used by Trump's henchmen in the Department of Homeland Security to attempt to blame the summer 2020 violence in Portland on Antifa, which turned into an incompetent shambles of an investigation, but still provided Trump with an excuse to deploy an army of DHS contractors on the streets of the city. The same phony narrative, amplified incessantly by far-right actors on social media, also inspired a wave of Antifa bus hoaxes. Remember all of that? That inspired hordes of heavily armed, quote, patriots to swarm the streets of various small towns across the nation last summer. When wildfires began burning up the West Coast, the same disinformation artists convinced their audiences, they probably also conceived their audiences, but some years earlier, convinced their audiences that Antifa arsonists were setting the fires, inducing clusters of right-wing goons to set up paramilitary checkpoints in rural areas. These attitudes, based almost entirely on right-wing and disinformation, have clearly spread widely from Seattle to Charlottesville and all points in between. just this week, the judge in the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse, yes, we might as well make mention of this, the teenager who gunned down 3 protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin last summer, informed attorneys in the case that they could not describe the 3 men, the shot by Rittenhouse, as victims. Can you believe that? But would permit defense attorneys to describe them as looters, rioters, or arsonists, even though none of the 3 were ever accused of those crimes. Sounds great. In other words, the judge has green-lighted Rittenhouse's attorneys to put the victims on trial. The underlying attitude at work here, namely that anti-fascists are evil incarnate, fit only for elimination, seems to have soaked into the American justice system at multiple levels. One can only hope that the jury in Charlottesville is able to begin turning the tide. Well, we do hope so. All right, let's see. All right, well, that was well worth catching up on. I mentioned to you earlier in the show that there would be more news about what was going on in the school rape story here from out of Loudoun County. When we last checked in on it, there was pushback from the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office about the narrative taking hold. And there are a lot of narratives surrounding the central story here. But they were pushing back against the narrative taking hold that there was some sort of cover-up involved in the case. And I mean, that still seems to be one of the chief grievances, not only of the parents of the victim of this first attack, but also, among their supporters, but among a lot of people who don't count themselves as supporters of the politicians and political movements trying to latch onto this case and use it for political gain. There's lots of people who are not interested in voting for Youngkin, not interested in voting for Republicans at all, and who are reacting solely to the part of this tragic story that focuses on the actual crime that happened here, the rape of this girl in school, and saying, the fact that the schools were slow in reacting to it or tried to cover up the fact that the attack had even happened or mislead people into believing that the attack hadn't happened, that is horrible and wrong, and we protest merely that aspect of the story in solidarity with the parents. But as it turns out, that was already falling apart last week when we read the stories on Friday about how that rumor came to be. That the parents of the victim here claim that they were told that the school was handling the investigation, they said the quote was, in-house. When what apparently was actually happening was that the school, as soon as they learned of the attack, because the girl who was attacked came to the authorities and told them fairly quickly afterwards, I mean, as soon as possible, it seems, there's no real sense that there was any serious delay in her reporting it. Not that it would matter one way or the other, but I mean, it's actually a good thing here to say, all right, well, she didn't walk around all day doubting herself and then have to be convinced to report it. She was strong enough to realize, no, I should be reporting this immediately. And thank God that lesson is soaked in with our kids, or at least some of them today. So well done to her in that respect. But she went and reported it, and they immediately involved the school resource officer, which I think is a term not universally understood and certainly not defined the same way in every jurisdiction. I see a lot of discussion around the country about, well, they reported it to a school resource officer, but that's like a mall cop. They needed to involve the sheriff's office right away, and they didn't do that, and then further it gets conflated into. Not only that, but when the sheriff's office officers when the deputies did arrive at the school, they had been called in response to an irate parent, the parent of the victim in this case, raging over how the case had been handled. And if you hadn't tried to handle it in-house with a mall cop in the first place, you wouldn't have this problem. Except that's not at all what SROs are about here at least here in Loudoun County, and I think probably everywhere in Virginia. But if anybody has any questions about whether or not they're real cops, I can answer it for you. They're real cops. We've met them. They make a point of that, on every back to school night, meet the SRO. And if you go to drop off, you used to be able to do this. If your kid forgets their lunch and you go to drop it off at school, and so that they don't starve or whine to you about how terrible the school lunch is in the cafeteria. And they're fine, but kids. Anyway, you will see that sheriff's deputy car parked out in front, right close to the door of the school. The idea being to establish a real presence from the sheriff's office on campus, which is not something that all people actually support, by the way. There's plenty of people who say, maybe we shouldn't have police presence in the schools, and given the record that police have in many places, like all around the country, with, let's say, racial sensitivities. But it's been outweighed by security needs of various kinds, including the massive number of school shootings that we've had in this country. And at any rate, anyway, I can tell you that they are absolutely 100% sheriff's deputies from the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office and nothing else. They just happen to be assigned to the school campus and make that their primary focus during the day. In fact, their sole focus during the day. So in no sense was having the school resource officer investigate the initial reports a diversion of the news from the sheriff's department. It's just false to say so. And while it's still true that the rest of the sheriff's deputies that ended up showing up ended up coming there because the irate parent was making a spectacle of himself and threatening all sorts of things, you can't have parents running around screaming at the principal and threatening violence and whatever else on site at the school. You're going to have to call the cops for them. That was just coincidence caused by the father himself there. But anyway, I still run into people who say, well, there was a cover-up. At the very least, they shouldn't have covered it up. And I keep asking, in what sense do you think that there was a cover-up? And they keep referring back to SROs as not being real cops. Anyway, that's not actually the biggest news from yesterday. The biggest news from yesterday was that the suspect in this case had his day in court, and it didn't go all that well for him, and some clarification on some of the other issues. You may recall that, of course, the whole thing blew up into a national issue when the father of the victim claimed in his speaking to, a certain select slice of the media, Daily Wire, and I think the Daily Caller as well, although I'm beginning to think that perhaps that was a reporting error in Newsweek. But it wouldn't surprise me if he also spoke to the Daily Caller. But which is where he launched the charge that the suspect in the case identified as transgender or gender fluid in some way, if there's any distinct difference between the two terms, and I'm not 100% clear whether there is or not. But also raising the claim that the attacker was wearing a skirt at the time. And I could find no confirmation of it, but it didn't surprise me that I could find no confirmation, given, again, that these were juveniles involved in the case, and it's fairly frequently the case that details are not forthcoming from the authorities in a juvenile case. Well, now, having seen the court proceedings covered by the Washington Post, we can at least confirm that no one felt that it was untrue, and no one raised any objection to it when it was mentioned in court. So it seems to be a part of the story. Of course, it's still not the case that the original accusation by the Republican political operatives in the middle of this story that it was Loudoun County's permissive transgender rights policy for students that enabled this rapist, this juvenile rapist, to place themselves in the bathroom, with impunity and have the right to be there. Again, the attack took place in May, and the policy of which the Republican operatives complain was adopted in August, so it's just not possible that this attack was motivated by exploitation of this particular policy. But in addition, they made great hay out of the fact that this student apparently identified as transgender and wore a skirt, as if to prove this, as if, well, you can't be properly transgender without a skirt somehow. I don't know what the story is, and we're not hearing from this particular student or from anybody connected to him about what the identity is. But I did notice, first thing I noticed on Monday, was it Monday or Tuesday? I guess on Monday I noticed it, but then, no, this trial was taking place on Tuesday, was that the official Loudoun County Public Schools statement about I guess it must have been yesterday, because it was about the outcome of the trial, was that they identified the perpetrator as a boy, which, if there is indeed, and there is, a Loudoun County Public Schools policy insisting that gender identities will be respected and that you're entitled to your pronouns, I guess they would either be in violation of that policy if their statement in fact identified this student as a boy. But that too is unclear, because it comes from my reading of a news report's coverage of the issuance of this statement. And I haven't seen the statement, and the part of the statement that they described, which used the word boy, is not set apart in quotes, so it's not clear that they get that terminology from the school board, which then raises issues, I guess, about the editorial policies of the outlet, which was I can't remember. It's the CBS affiliate here in the D.C. area, Channel 9, that I was reading. WUSA, thank you. Okay. How can I forget that? I must hate America. All right. Well, I was thinking of WTOP, which is the radio station, got me all confused, and I was like, all right, I can't remember. Okay, WUSA. But anyway, more important, I think, is the details of, I guess, the timeline of events and some important things that appear to have been omitted from the Daily Wire style record on this thing, as described by the father of the victim. That probably won't surprise you. All right, the Washington Post article, before we run out of time, and we may already do that and run into the next segment. Headline, in case at center of political firestorm, judge finds teen committed sexual assault in Virginia school bathroom. So, that part seems to have come out as expected and as it should have. This did happen, and it's wrong, and they're holding the kid as accountable as you can hold a juvenile, I guess. All right, here's the story. Justin Juvenal is the reporter on this one. In a case that has generated a political firestorm, a Virginia juvenile court judge found sufficient evidence during a trial Monday to sustain charges that a teen sexually assaulted a classmate in the girls' bathroom of a Loudoun County high school in May. The teenager, now 15, is also charged with the sexual assault of another student that occurred months later at a different Loudoun school. Loudoun County Juvenile Court Chief Judge Pamela L. Brooks said she would wait to sentence the teen until that case is decided in November. The judge's finding is the juvenile court equivalent of a guilty verdict in other courts, in case you were wondering. The case generated local and national attention after the parents of the girl assaulted in May said the charged youth was, quote, gender fluid, prompting renewed backlash against a policy in Loudoun County schools that allows transgender students to use the bathrooms that match their gender identity. That policy was adopted after the May assault. And a lot of the accusations, by the way, of cover-up are not so much necessarily about to which police officers the assault was initially reported and why they responded to the school. We're definitely going to run into our break here. But just as well, I'll save the really, I think, revelatory new details for after the break. But a lot of the charge of cover-up is that it was some sort of political cover-up. That is, that they had to suppress the details of the May attack that is, that the attacker identified as gender fluid and that it was happening in the bathroom, etc., in order to preserve the narrative necessary to go ahead with the adoption of the transgender rights policy. So that's the working theory of opponents and others on the periphery of the case, saying, yeah, if you admitted clearly and cleanly that the perpetrator here identified as transgender or gender fluid and that it happened in the bathroom, then you would never be able to adopt this new policy in the wake of the outrage that would surely ensue. Well, okay. I've kept you on the edge of the seat long enough, but we do have to take a break. You're probably guessing, since I hinted earlier, this all falls apart. Not in exactly the way I was expecting either. We'll be right back, and I'll tell you more about it. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Ready for this one? Okay, I guess at this point, it'd probably be wise to offer up, I guess, if not an official trigger warning, because I don't really understand the protocols of that well enough to feel confident that I'm doing it correctly, and I don't want anybody to rely on what my idea of a trigger warning is. This is the best warning I can give you. Obviously, you know by now that this case involves a rape. But in this case, I guess maybe this isn't trigger warning per se, but I want to prepare the stage for this by saying there is so the new details of this case bring us an element that is fraught with danger and difficulty when you discuss it. So we'll say at the outset that the charge of rape here is correct. The conviction appears, to my limited view, also to be, legitimate and correct. That's what happened. There are circumstances. You remember when we were reading the Newsweek articles the other day, the Sheriff's Department said not only was the fact that it was a juvenile justice case getting in the way of their ability to share detail about what was going on, but they also said they opted for, and the school authorities opted to move the accused student to a different school pending trial, which was finally just held yesterday, right? You can't keep the kid out of school. You can't suspend him and punish. Well, I mean, again, now I'm wondering about the right pronouns here, because it's not entirely clear what's going on with this student. But you can't keep this student out of school before they've been adjudicated as having lost, whatever right there is to access to education that you might impose on somebody who's been convicted. So they thought, at the very least, let's move this student to another school because of the complications of this case. You remember that the sheriff's office said that this was a complicated case. The victim and perpetrator know one another. They're familiar with one another. It creates all sorts of tensions to keep the two of them obviously in the same school together. And although they recognize that there's a danger in moving the student to another school, I think we made mention of this fact, but maybe not. We might not have gotten to this over on Friday, but I may have learned it over the weekend. That, obviously lots of parents then begin to imagine, well, obviously, there was another assault at this second high school that they moved this student to. So that proves that you had a blatant disregard for the danger that the student posed to the students at the school you were moving this person to. And I think that also not a particularly accurate reading of what was going on, because apparently this student was wearing an ankle monitor during the time in which they were present in this other school. So the school board was pretty clearly aware that there was a risk, and they took steps to mitigate that risk. Let's keep a very close eye on this student and make sure that nothing like this happens again. And in fact, the second attack, which I remind you did not take place in a bathroom, even though lots of activists and vocal people protesting loudly about the aspects of this case keep trying to say that this, it happened again. Another rape in another bathroom in another school. And that's not what happened here. But that the authorities were able to, I guess, step in and intervene and break up this second attack because, in fact, the student was monitored. And when he forced another student into an empty classroom and attacked her, I guess they were on top of it pretty quick and able to break it up. And thank God that was the case, because they took these steps to make sure that this wouldn't or couldn't happen in the same way. And I don't see a lot of credit being given for that. I mean, it's not really the right time for giving credit or anything. So maybe that's it. Anyway, I mentioned that there's a stage that needs to be set here, because it turns out that the circumstances of the first attack, the totality of the circumstances, are fairly complicated and are of the sort that sometimes, often, people point to in an effort to shift the blame for the attack onto the victim. So that exists here, and you can already begin to imagine what's going on. Is it, what she was wearing? No, not what she was wearing. Is it her prior behavior or her prior relationship with this suspect, or now convicted perpetrator of the act? Yeah, that's where we are on this. So keeping in mind that we're all, or should be all, fully aware of that a no in the middle of a chain of yeses still means no, and that prior consent to any kind of contact whatsoever means nothing in the context of a firm no on a different day at a different time, and that the no needs to be respected. And if it's not, you're talking about assault. And if you're talking about the worst kind of assault, you're talking about rape, because there's consent missing in this. With that in mind, and the fact that we all understand that, let's discover what they have for us here in the Washington Post. Authorities have not commented on the youth's gender identity, and it did not become an issue Monday in court. By the way, the right wing running around with this report and saying it certainly did, so the Washington Post is a bunch of liars. It did and it didn't. It depends on, how firmly you cling to certain modes of belief. You'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. During the hearing, the 15-year-old victim in the first case testified she had consensual sexual encounters with the defendant on 2 occasions in a girl's bathroom at Stonebridge High School in Ashburn, where the first attack took place. I'm putting the emphasis very purposefully on a certain part of this sentence. Yes, she had sexual encounters with the defendant. Understood. We understand that doesn't mean that the defendant is in any way entitled to any other encounters of any kind. The important part to me is that it took place on 2 occasions in the girl's bathroom. Because remember, everything for the right wing on this, the political operatives, hinges on the idea that the transgender student rights policy in the Loudoun County Public Schools motivated this perpetrator and will motivate others to use their gender fluid status to hide in the shadows of the bathroom, waiting on random victims to come in and use the bathroom and then spring upon them and assault them. That's the whole narrative here. And what's actually happening is consensual sexual encounters in that setting, and all happening prior to the policy, by the way. On May 28th, she said, that is to say, the 15-year-old victim in this case, the victim said the two arranged to meet again, and the youth then, now we have a problem, threw her to the floor and forced her to perform sex acts. That's where the problem arises. Prior to that, consensual meeting, okay, fine, doesn't really bear on this. To me, the interesting part is these are arranged meetings in the girls' bathroom. The part of the narrative that is crucial to the right, that transgender students are hiding in bathrooms to which they are not, in their view, entitled to access and attacking students at random, now looks like it just didn't happen, just doesn't exist. So, the case has also sparked anger from parents who have questioned why the teen was allowed to attend another school, right? And the answer is because he hasn't been convicted of anything, while awaiting trial in the May assault. It has prompted the head of Loudoun County Schools to embark on major reforms to the district's disciplinary procedures to prevent similar occurrence. Although I think they did a, not the greatest job in the world, certainly, but they did do something that enabled them to foil a equally egregious attack in the second instance, and I'm glad that they at least did that. Let's see. Actually, before we move on from here, I'm thinking again about one other aspect of what we heard reported, and maybe it's a time to jump in with this. So again, the situation is that there's a series of agreed upon meetings in the girls' room. That's their designated space for whatever reason. And actually, maybe we read on at this point, but I remind you of this. I'm sorry. I'm having difficulty deciding in what order to present all this information. Let me continue on for just a second. Then I'll jump back to what we read and discussed about this news from Newsweek last Friday. Just a reminder. Okay, so it's prompted the head of Loudoun County Schools to embark on major reforms. They want to prevent this from happening again, obviously. It has also become an issue in the Virginia governor's race. We learned about that and discussed that on Friday as well, where in recent days, Republican candidate Glenn Youngkin has called for an investigation of the Loudoun County School Board and demanded more police in schools. More police in schools, SROs, by the way, in response to the incidents. Now, on Monday in the trial, right, the teenage victim of the Stone Bridge assault testified that she and her attacker had agreed to meet up in a school bathroom around 12:15 p.m. on the date of the assault. She testified they had not explicitly discussed having sex beforehand. So right there, trouble, right? He's again using but I don't know, because for whatever reason, this is still unclear that the identity of this student. But I guess I should just assume. Why not just assume using some sort of neutral pronoun is the best approach, and I just have to get used to that. All right. So already, though, that's an indication that, all right, they might have different ideas in mind, and so it's easy to get your head around the fact that the perpetrator goes way beyond what is allowed and expected, even though it's an arranged meeting. Just to emphasize that again. The teen testified, the girl, that she arrived first, by the way, and chose to go in the girls' bathroom because the two had always met in the girls' bathroom in the past. When, it says here again, when the boy arrived, that's actually the language from the Washington Post reporting, so we're all having this problem. When the boy arrived, the teen testified, he came into the handicapped stall where she was in and locked the door. Now, the description of the actual events inside the attack. The two talked before the girl testified the boy began grabbing her neck and other parts of her body in a sexual manner. She testified she told her attacker she was not in the mood for sex, but he forced himself on her. He flipped me over, the girl testified. I was on the ground and couldn't move, and he sexually assaulted me. That's all you need for the rape, right? The attack only stopped when someone came into the bathroom and startled the defendant, the victim testified. Here, I'll go on. The girl testified that a second sexual assault occurred a little later. This is a little puzzling and a little unclear in terms of what exactly happened. And I'd like to know more, but, I guess that's not going to be forthcoming. But isn't that puzzled me a little bit. The attack stopped when someone comes into the bathroom and startles the defendant. And then there's a second sexual assault a little later, and I don't know how much later. And it might be just that, I guess you could imagine that he pauses in his attack and insists that she remain quiet and not scream or anything so that the attack can't be fully broken up. And then when the person leaves, the attack resumes. Could that be an accurate description that fits this? I don't know. But at any rate, the judge found there was sufficient evidence to find the defendant had forced the girl into 2 sex acts. The Washington Post generally, they go on to say, does not name the victims of sexual assault, and it's not identifying the girl or her parents. The parent has been more forthcoming with his identity, obviously. The Post also generally does not identify defendants charged as juveniles. The defendant's attorney, William Mann, said in his opening statement that the encounter between the 2 teens was consensual, just like the ones that had occurred on 2 previous occasions. They discussed sex regularly, Mann said. The encounter was just like it was before. That usually, thankfully, these days doesn't work as well anymore, but that was the old fallback, and that's the defense that they're offering. The defendant did not testify during the trial, but prosecutors played interviews he gave detectives investigating the case, during which he acknowledged, quote, messing up, and said he did not intend to perform one sex act with the victim. Don't ask me. And he said he stopped once he realized he was hurting the girl. I mean, grabbing her around the neck will probably be a pretty good indication that you're hurting the girl, but people do different things. The defendant initially told detectives the second sexual act did not occur, but later said it may have happened briefly and accidentally, and this is the only mention of this other issue, when a knee-length skirt he was wearing, got caught on his watch as the pair were fumbling around in the bathroom stall. That's odd all by itself, but now at least there's something on the record that we can see about a skirt. So Dad's not completely wrong that there's a skirt, that the kid wears a skirt. And that would lead you to think, well, maybe he identifies as gender fluid. Maybe he doesn't identify as he. I don't know. That's still unclear. The 2 teens, it turns out, had met about a month and a half before the attack and became friends. Fine. The girl testified. The teens were not in the same grade but shared friends in common. Loudoun County Deputy Commonwealth's Attorney Barry A. Zweig said in court that the teens had, quote, sexually charged conversations on the social media app Discord in the days leading up to the assault. Zweig said the boy repeatedly asked the girl to engage in a particular sex act, but she rebuffed him each time. That's pretty clear. That's all no. The day before the assault, Zweig said the victim had been hospitalized because of a health condition that made her weak, and the defendant utilized her physical helplessness to take advantage of her. Also bad. The same youth has also been accused in an October 6th alleged sexual assault at Broad Run High School in Ashburn, authorities have said. In the October 7th news release, the sheriff's office outlined the allegations, saying the 15-year-old male student had forced the victim into an empty classroom where he held her against her will and inappropriately touched her. We learned that last week. The family of the victim of the Stonebridge High School assault said they are gratified, as I said earlier, by the outcome of the case. No one should have to endure what this family has endured, and now their focus is completely on their daughter's health and safety as she progresses forward with her life, the family said in a statement. That is the end of the article about the courtroom appearance. Now I will jump back to the idea of cover-up that advocates in this case keep coming back to. We've discussed the question of police cover-up, which just seems to have collapsed, given that, one, school resource officers are in fact actual genuine sheriff's deputies. Two, we see here that they actually speak to the kid immediately after. There's nothing in-house going on here, and in-house doesn't mean what outsiders seem to want to think it means. And they do, in fact, interview the suspect pretty quickly after the attack and get a statement from him that's, essentially used against him in court to get the conviction that we heard about yesterday. I guess what I wanted to come back to is the other charge of cover-up, that somehow the school board was covering things up, either just in general or in order to protect, as the other side would have it, in order to protect their plan to introduce this transgender rights policy even after this attack. The right-wing folks and parents and operatives who were interested in stopping the policy or rescinding the policy, they need it to be the case. And they did everything they could, despite the fact that the timeline made it obviously untrue. They did everything they could to blur the lines so that people reading these headlines in passing would believe that there was a policy already in place that permitted this student to be in the girl's bathroom, and that he then placed himself there in order to spring out and surprise this girl with no prior arrangement of any kind, and all of that falls apart. We now learned about the skirt, but there's still no word on how the perpetrator of this attack identifies. So it's very, very difficult to connect it the way the right-wing operatives want to connect it in order for people to believe that one thing led to another here. But they still cling to this cover-up. And the father of the victim, who tells his story about how at every turn, while trying to advocate for his daughter, he ends up being victimized by the police and the school board as part of the cover-up. They keep arresting him and throwing him out of places. He comes as an irate parent to pick up his daughter who's just been assaulted, and I think we can all understand why you would be irate, but then his story of the whole thing is, well, I came to complain and say the police needed to be involved. They already were. And when they involved themselves in dragging me out of there. They came to suppress me so that they could have their precious policy. Well, they suppressed you because you were unruly and disruptive, and that's what police do with unruly and disruptive people. Sometimes they do it with people who aren't unruly and disruptive and lie about their being unruly and disruptive. But they generally don't look a lot like you. Sometimes, though, right? Anyway, might as well point that out. But the rest of the cover-up claim is, well, the reason that this father gets himself arrested at the school board meeting subsequent to all this in June, and that becomes the famous incident and the viral video of him being dragged out and once again silenced so that the school board, the evil school board, can have their nasty, evil policy and preserve it, which still hasn't happened. It's still only June, right? He says, I was set off by the school superintendent's denial of the incident. And then he says, somebody came right up to me and said they denied to my face that my daughter was raped, and that was too much for me, and I became angry, and that's how this thing happened. Well, okay. But as it turns out, I went back and looked at the Newsweek article that we read. Remember, Scott Ziegler, Loudoun County Superintendent, faces calls to resign over school assault allegations. And I believe this is the one where Yes, okay. Well, for one thing, he says, all right, he's asked about this by somebody else. And remember, the story of the dad here is that he just went to the meeting to observe, that he hadn't signed up to be a public speaker. And he maintains that he had no intention of speaking there. But I don't know how true that is, or whether it's even worth believing, because of, you seem to think, well, of course he might speak. He might not sign up to be a public speaker, but he certainly might raise his voice. And eventually he did. Anyway, the comment that supposedly set this whole thing off and supposedly means there's a cover-up is the superintendent saying, I think it's important to keep our perspective on this. We've heard it several times tonight from our public speakers, but the predator transgender student or person simply does not exist. And then the reporting goes on to say, Smith said he became irate at the comments, knowing that his daughter had allegedly been assaulted just weeks beforehand. Yes. Now, looking very carefully at the statement, which is not something that people who are irate are going to do in the moment, what the superintendent appears to be saying is the actual truth of the situation. The idea of a predator transgender student hiding in the bathroom, leaping out and attacking passersby at random isn't true. That student, that transgender person, does not exist. They're not at this school anyway. I mean, lots of people still believe they exist elsewhere. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But we were talking about them existing here at Stonebridge High School. And the fact is, well, it's a complicated case. And as it turns out, no, there wasn't anybody hiding in the bathroom waiting to surprise people at random. It was an arranged meeting among two people who knew one another and had consensual, apparently, consensual meetings, sexual in nature, if not, meetings to actually have sex, in the girls' bathroom. That was the chosen location. And remember, again, this is all before there was any kind of sort of policy permitting anything like this. Throw in the skirt, and that's enough to blur the lines to the point where it explodes into a national issue, and that there are still people out there who I think in many cases are committed progressive Democrats who have stepped into this controversy at the point where they are speaking up for the girl here and for all girls in school and looking for a safe environment from them. Some who are opposed to the policy of allowing transgender students to choose their own bathroom and locker room facilities for fear that something like this will happen, and to preserve. And I think here, I have to acknowledge the legitimacy of, or to understand the fears of people who say, well, there really, at this young age, needs to be single-sex spaces for this. And I can't get into the discussion. I'm not qualified to get into the discussion of whether or not transgenderism erases sexes. That's a claim that I can't substantiate, but that a lot of people claim to believe in. But yeah, I'm still troubled. I'm not that progressive in that sense. I'm still troubled by the idea that there could be girls, teenage girls who have, legitimate or otherwise, have fears about themselves and their bodies and what other people perceive when they see them, and feel safer in single-sex environments. And I feel like I wish I could think of a really good way to accommodate transgender students who feel like they would be in danger if they went to the locker room or bathroom facilities to which they would be assigned by their birth gender, if we can still talk about such a thing, and they need to have a safe space, true. But if they need a safe space, then it's just as legitimate to say that there are single-sex safe spaces that are necessary too. So, yeah, I'm not that in tune with that part of the agenda. But I will say this. What the superintendent appears to have said here is this imagined incident of a transgender person using a policy to plant themselves in the bathroom to spring out and surprise didn't happen. And that's pretty clearly stated here. Everybody else wanted to hear something completely different. How dare you say that this didn't happen? How dare you say that this student doesn't exist because my daughter was attacked, and then everybody jumping up in righteous indignation to defend this girl. And like I said, some good progressives out there saying, well, the school should never have said that it didn't happen. You can't deny it. You got to believe the victims in all this. Well, we believe that she was raped. They did everything that they needed to do to report that. What they're saying, though, is having heard the circumstances here, it's not true that the dark, weird, gothic fantasy that people have about people lurking in the shadows is happening. That's not happening. He's correct in saying so. And it's not a cover-up to say so either. So I find that kind of interesting and, well, troubling, and something we're going to have to spend some more time pondering, or at least the courts and the school boards will have to spend more time pondering. In the meantime, perhaps maybe we shouldn't be calling up anonymously and threatening school board members with death and their children with rape, given that a lot of what you think you know about this case may have been misinformation or something misunderstood by you, perhaps willfully so. Maybe a step back from the threats of violence would be warranted, don't you think? I hope you think so now too. Time now to hand things over. How'd you like to take the reins now, Justice? Okay, Justice Putnam, you're up next.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, it's not your fault, but here's what he's got in store for you on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Let's see. Mo Brooks blamed his staff for his involvement in the January 6th insurrection and said, the one, of course, that he says he was not a part of. Don't know what his staff was doing involved with it. Much more to talk about that during the rest of the week and next.